Talk, our first tech talk for 2021 and the launch of Digital Rights Watch's State of Digital Rights report for 2020, which was kind of almost unfinished business for the year, but I think it's great that we're launching this to give a bit of momentum for the year to come. Welcome everyone, my name's Peter Lewis. I'm Director of the Centre for Responsible Technology, and we've been really pleased to be partnering over the last year with Digital Rights Watch in running these tech talks. And today, for those that are new, it's an hour discussion. You're encouraged to have your camera on, use the chat to introduce yourself. But unlike the normal tech talks where Lizzie and I, and sometimes Dan Stinton, just gibber on the issue of the day, today is going to be a little bit structured. And Lucy from Digital Rights Watch is actually going to be our MC and run the show. So before we do that, I will just pay respects to traditional owners. I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney, wherever you are. I know you will join me in paying respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognising the land we're all on was never ceded. And on that note, I'm going to have a really easy job today and hand it over to Lucy to kick off the show.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thanks everyone for joining us. I just shared with you in the comments the link to the report, so feel free to click on that and read it after or browse through it as we go through today. I'm really excited to welcome a huge amount of the people who participated and contributed to the report. For some of you who know Digital Rights Watch for a wee while, there was a report that was published in 2018, and we just thought it was time to try and bring it back, hopefully on an annual basis. So we're going to try and do this mad rush next year as well, to archive some of the conversations happening in Australia around the internet. Obviously, the conversations are global, but I think Australia doesn't quite always make the headlines internationally. So it's worth having a sort of archival document down here. We thought it was also important to uplift some of the activists and voices who are working on this, who don't necessarily always have a platform. So we're going to continue doing that into next year. So we hope that it becomes a sort of collaborative project and people come to us to pitch things they want to see in it for next year. Obviously, we'll keep reaching out through our network. So that's all I want to say in terms of intro. We have people joining us, some not joining us due to time zones. I'm not sure if I should go through all the names. Maybe that will be a little boring. We can do it as we go through. We've loosely structured this session to go through the report categories, but obviously, if we veer off and there are questions that you guys just want to shout in with, or raise your hands and, pop in with something that you saw as particularly startling, that would be super helpful. Peter handed over to me very nicely, but he will also be obviously chiming in. Peter contributed to the report on worker surveillance. So I think that's a topic we'll get into. So off to a nice start. I guess I would say, looking at 2020, how has the environment shifted in regards to digital rights? And maybe I'll start with Lizzie, just because it's a familiar face for all of you to kick us off. And then I'll ask some of the other folks who have joined us. I'll go through the names because it will just be easier. We have Scott Ludlam and Catherine Gledhill Tucker, who wrote about environmental activism and digital rights. I like it. Yeah, wave at the gentle people. We have Mark Andreevich, who wrote about public space surveillance for us. Hi, Mark. We have Vanessa Teague joining in as well, who wrote about cybersecurity and Australia's need to establish trust with all of us out here. We have our own campaigner at Digital Rights Watch, Samantha Floriani, joining us, who wrote a wonderful piece about content moderation and online platforms. We have Justin Warren, who wrote about privacy and the need for privacy reform. Of course, Lizzie, who's about to speak, did our forward. And as I mentioned, Peter wrote about workplace surveillance. So Lizzie, do you mind kicking us off? Just what has been different and somewhat unique in 2020 about digital rights?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer succinctly, but I'm going to have a go. I mean, I think probably everyone has been reflecting on a pretty intense 2020. And the obvious thing to me, as someone who chairs Digital Rights Watch and is interested in digital rights topics, is that it highlighted just how dependent we are on the internet and the web, and how people were starting to come to terms with that, but then also wonder about what kind of protection their rights had in online spaces. And I think Lucy's right to talk about Australia as a particular kind of case study, because, we're an Anglophone country, but, we're a member of the Five Eyes, so the intelligence sharing alliance between the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. But in many ways, we don't have rights protections like there are in Europe. We don't have a Bill of Rights in our constitution like the United States does. So we're similar to these countries, but we are also potentially a testing ground for some pretty troubling attempts to surveil people. And we also have to contend with companies that provide a lot of our services, but may not be located here for the purposes of regulation. And how you grapple with those issues is a particularly Australian thing. So looking at it from that perspective, if you think about corporations and governments holding considerable power over our digital lives, and that coming to the fore in the context of a pandemic where we spend so much more of our time online, I think a lot of people are starting to wonder what kind of protection our rights have, and how this might start to take form in settings where we don't usually think about digital rights, workplace surveillance being one, but also things like environmental activism, where we might think that this is important, but not necessarily a digital rights issue. Well, in the context of 2020, it's clear that that's not true, that a lot of these issues have a digital lens, and we need to start thinking about it. So I think the report is a really interesting contribution to those discussions, and hopefully we can continue having those discussions at least on an annual basis, but hopefully start to build the number of voices who are talking on these issues and everyone's understanding of the complexity of them by hearing from those diverse voices, so that we can start to actually, turn around some of these policy issues, reclaim power in these digital spaces. So if you're interested in particular topics, you can delve into the report in that way. But also, if you're perhaps new to thinking about digital technology, it will hopefully give you a breadth of an understanding of how these issues intersect with other issues that you might not have considered digital ones before. So yeah, I think it's worth reading from cover to cover, but I also think you can dip in and out of it if that's your choice. But I think everybody has perhaps gained an appetite for thinking about digital rights issues, because it's so obvious now how dependent we are on the web, and how that means we need to be able to take power back when we don't like what companies and governments are doing.
Well, we did try to make it bite-sized, so I forced everybody's hand to kind of stick to a word limit, because we did want it to be readable cover to cover. So hopefully you guys find that was fruitful, and I didn't torment everyone for no reason. I don't know, there's a lot to unpick in what Lizzie said. Justin, I wonder, you wrote a piece about Privacy Act reform, and do you want to just chime in here? What's Australia, how's Australia doing in terms of what we're seeing internationally, and is it time? Will we see what we want in privacy reform?
Hopefully. We are reviewing it at the moment. There's a live inquiry on privacy happening right now, which is encouraging. We do have the Privacy Act, which is, look, it's better than nothing. And it has provided some constraints, and it has had some impact. I think Health Engine was a company that got wrapped over the knuckles and fined. Unfortunately, in Australia, the problem we have is that the regulator that's in charge of it, and also the regulatory regime we have, does kind of hamstring things a little bit. The OAIC, as people might be familiar with, has inside of it the Information Commissioner, who actually does, there's three roles sort of wrapped up in one person. They're actually supposed to be separate. That's a funding issue. The government tried to actually abolish the office some years ago, and then kind of reneged at the last minute and funded it a little bit. And then it gave it some gap funding, which wasn't ever really enough. A lot of that funding expires this year. So they're going to go back to doing all of the things that they were doing originally, plus everything that keeps getting added to their plate, but without being funded properly. So unfortunately, we end up with this situation where we've got laws that aren't actually enforced, which is effectively not having them at all. Or they're enforced sporadically, and they're only in large situations where it makes a big impact, because you've got people saying, well, of all the things that we could do, where do we spend our effort? We've been trying to advocate for a right of private action for some time to help people kind of take ownership of that themselves. It was recommended by the Australian Law Reform Commission back in 2014. So none of this is new. Hopefully we'll see some movement on that from the government's review. But more broadly, I think we can be fairly positive. People are consistently in favour of privacy and have been for years. So what we're seeing now is the impact of this lack of privacy, particularly from the big tech companies. The backlash to that is manifesting across the world. So we had GDPR passed in the EU. That's sort of acted as a bit of a dam breaker, and we had privacy legislation in California. We're seeing some similar movements in other states in the United States. So there is this general international mood that there should be greater privacy protection and better data regulation. So the international pressure is there, the domestic pressure is there. All that remains is for government to actually get off their bums and do something about it. And we'll see how well they do that. It would be nice if Australia didn't lag the rest of the world in this area along with all of the others.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be nice. I like to hear you speak when you're a little optimistic. It's new to me, but I like it.
It is rare. It is rare, but
indeed,
there is cause for hope.
So yeah, so far, I wonder, has this sort of emphasis on privacy, is that, Peter, do you want to, have you seen those sort of shift? I mean, you guys do a bit of polling on this front, and obviously we're coordinating a little bit on the privacy review. How do you feel people are responding to that?
Look, I think we're at a time when, particularly in respect of the big platforms, Facebook and Google, their social license currently is under challenge. And when we ask questions about regulating big tech or taxing big tech, there's really strong public support for that. To Justin's point, I think we are in a moment where around the world governments are trying to work out how to regulate these platforms. The privacy review is part of the ACCC agenda that Rod Sims has been developing over the last couple of years. And some of you may know that the Centre's been really supportive of the News Bargaining Code. And I know there's different views even in this report, and that's probably a debate for a separate tech talk. I know we've had a few of those already, Lizzie, but I think my broader point is that if we can create a culture where there is bipartisan interest in working out how to regulate big tech, even when they don't want to play along, it opens up for a real change in the way that infrastructure is operating. And one of the things I've been saying around the bargaining code is it's the first step in a process that includes the privacy review, includes reviewing the way ad tech works, which is creepy and opaque, and also having a fresh look at disinformation. So I'm quite optimistic that we are creating a wave of regulation, and the fact that, clearly with the support of Murdoch and the media, but a conservative government regulating big tech is a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously Digital Rights Watch will be prioritizing. We've been engaged in the Media Code quite a bit, but we'll be prioritizing the Privacy Act review. And I saw in the comments here just pop up folks asking for a link to it. I think the submissions closed in December for that initial round, but they will be back with a draft. And there'll be, or I think initially they promised they'll be back with like another white paper or something like that, or a draft. So keep an eye on it. It's going to pop up for more public comment, and if you're subscribed to our updates, you should be if you're not already, we will certainly be following you very closely. So keep an eye out. Yeah, I really appreciate this. I wonder, Scott, you are following this, I think, along, and Lizzie already touched upon this a little bit, about how the online offline worlds intersect, and we've seen that in 2020 more than ever. And obviously we'll delve into the piece that you guys contributed even more in a later stage with Kat. But how, from your perspective, has there been, has this year sort of brought forth some of the issues about how we treat online world, and that we don't have some of the freedoms we would expect offline, or vice versa?
Yeah, it has. Hey, that's a good segue. I might continue just in spirit of optimism, because it's just as rare for me. But the report, for people on the call who've only just seen the link, is a wonderful kind of aggregation and a bit of a helicopter view of the landscape. And thanks to Lizzie and Sam and Lucy and the whole team for putting it together. It's a great resource. And that theme does come through really strongly. This distinction between rights online and offline was never real, and it's even more apparent. I just wanted to flag, if we're going to speak a little bit more about the kind of targeted communities, because we're dealing on the one hand with a rights agenda that is a human rights agenda that's across the board. It affects everybody, but we also have this concern for targeted communities, whether they be people of color in a pandemic that's being over-policed, environmental justice activists, dissidents, journalists, whistleblowers, like targeted communities for which these tools and digital rights protections are very, the need for that is very acute. I just want to quickly flag on the way through 3 big kind of Commonwealth initiatives that got either disrupted or splattered all over the landscape. One being the Parliamentary Joint Committee's rejection of the facial recognition. It's not strictly 2020, it was late 2019, but like that never happens. That's a big deal. It was a really unusual fracturing of the cross-party consensus that whatever the Attorney General's Department and Home Affairs Department demands, they get. I don't want to lose that just because the facial recognition agenda slipped a little bit off the front burner, and Mark's piece in the report is superb on this. My health record splattered all over the landscape by a broad, very scrappy insurgency of people who are just like, no, I'm not participating. And robo-debt, like consequences at last, not political consequences as much as we would like to see, but like 3 really big picture digital rights campaigns where we pushed back in various forms, and the machine had to take a step back. And so I just think those are examples, and maybe, the My Health Record and the robo-debt might not in the past have been considered as traditional digital rights campaigns, but that's exactly what we're talking about. They affect huge numbers of people. So my optimistic take is, even if we're not organised in a sharp branded campaign, sometimes scrappy insurgencies or really broad-based discontent can bring a win.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to look back on those things. For me, I'm from Europe, which some of you will know, not everyone. But we just had basically the entire government of the Netherlands resign over penalizing sort of social welfare and coming after families for debt that they didn't owe. So it was a very different political consequence there to an entirely different. And there, I think the government wasn't even as heavily involved as this government was in setting up that scheme. So I think talking about accountability, whether that's for companies or governments, is incredibly important, and what that looks like in the real world, whether that's, remedy and financial sort of remedy to individuals, or people actually losing a job occasionally over a terrible decision they made. But I agree that the signal that refusing that identity matching bill sent was huge. And I remember discussing it with international colleagues to say that there is still some sense left in the Australian government on these topics, for sure. And I saw Vanessa kind of nodding along as Scott was speaking. And Vanessa's piece in the report is super interesting because it takes a slightly different approach to its analysis than the others. But Vanessa recaps the cybersecurity strategy and what we see there versus what we don't see there, and why that's particularly interesting. And so building on top of this sort of government positioning on things, Vanessa, do you want to just briefly tell us why the absence of certain language is interesting? I can't hear you. Can others? Nope. Nope. Wouldn't be a virtual meeting if we didn't have a microphone problem. Let's see if she can fix it really quickly. Otherwise, we'll step and a hop. Okay. Testing, Vanessa. Otherwise, I'll hop over and we'll come back to cybersecurity. Okay, awesome. So rolling from there into sort of what we saw, I think in 2020 was a real conversation about surveillance. because health surveillance globally just suddenly, kind of came into the limelight. What measures can governments take to protect the public health? And what sort of infringements in Europe? There was also a conversation about what sort of infringement on privacy and data protection might there be in that sort of space. And Mark, I wonder, people haven't read the report yet, so you have the element of surprise on your side, but do you just want to walk us through some of the things that we've seen in public space surveillance, and why is that an important thing to be concerned about? Public space, right?
Thanks, Lucy. I'll start with maybe some of the, pandemic response. But I'll note more broadly, I think it's really interesting. We've heard a couple of notes of optimism. I also find myself not optimistic, but surprised at those moments when optimism is possible. But the current kind of backlash or techlash against the big platforms is, I think, one of the things, along with forms of activism, that's kind of helping open the space for that. What I've been following for quite some time is the attempt through the deployment of various forms of technology to make physical space as monitorable as online space, right? Kind of take this metaphor of the online monitored space and then figure out how can we do that to physical space? And ubiquitous computing, smart speakers, you can think of all the different forms of embedded sensors that try to replicate that. Like, how can we keep track of people in physical space the way we do in virtual spaces? And my contribution to the report looks at facial recognition technology, because that's an area that I've been kind of working on most recently. And it is, I would complement the observation, which I think is a really important one, of the kind of slow rolling of the National Facial Recognition Database with, at the same time, the kind of commercial sector's attempt to really ramp up facial recognition technology, especially in response to the pandemic. And one of the things that I did in this past year, because we couldn't travel, a lot of these conferences that are facial recognition technology conferences went online, and so I could go to them virtually. And it was really interesting to see the way the commercial sector immediately pivoted in the face of the pandemic towards seeing a kind of concern with touchlessness and forms of symptom monitoring and quarantine monitoring as a huge marketing opportunity for the tech that they're developing. So a whole infrastructure of smart cameras that are able to do things like monitor social distancing, determine whether people are wearing masks, even determine whether they're wearing masks properly, recognize them even when they're wearing masks, develop forms of transaction and interaction that are touchlessness thanks to facial recognition technology. Interestingly, these conferences, like a facial recognition or automated vision conference, would have several sections devoted to doors, because they were thinking about access points that could be rendered touchless via facial recognition technology. Of course, for that to happen, the building, the door, the institution has to recognize who you are. They have to have a database in place. So there's a big push in the private sector to develop these infrastructures that enable a whole range of deployment of facial recognition technology. And it's not just facial recognition technology. They're realizing, because of concerns about bias and accuracy, that they need to supplement it with other forms of identification at a distance. So coming up with, combining gait recognition, how you walk, with facial recognition technology leads to much higher accuracy of identification, or so they claim. We see these, and this is one of those areas where, on the one hand, we look at the kind of government top-down approach, and on the other hand, the kind of private sector, I don't know, bottom-up isn't really the right word, but more distributed implementation of the technology. And one of the developments which was really concerning, that many of you probably followed, was the Clearview AI stuff, the recognition that it's possible to create consumer-facing facial recognition technology based on databases that are scraped off of through online sources. And that's an interesting avenue potentially for regulation, right? If you've been following that case, what Clearview did was it just went and pulled publicly available images, often off of social media platforms. And some jurisdictions have biometrics laws that require that count an image of your face as biometric information that you have to provide. If that information about you is collected, you have to be informed, and you have to be given the choice, right? And so there are lawsuits that are taking place in the US where those jurisdictions have those laws in place that are suing Clearview because it didn't get permission when it collected that information. And it's an interesting question about where the sources for these databases come. I don't know if anybody saw this, but New York Times recently had an article. I can put a link to it. There's I think I've got it here. This is this allows you to see if your images have been collected for various facial recognition databases, but they're only able to do it off of one platform, so it's just Flickr photos. But it's an interesting type of response. Could you do something like that for other platforms and show the ways in which your information is being collected? So my big picture concern here is this. For the past couple of years, it's looked like facial recognition is really on the cusp of some kind of widespread implementation. There are a whole host of problems with it that have received widespread attention: bias, reliability, accuracy, and those have been the basis of bans on the use of the tech, and calls for bans in Australia of the use of the technology. It doesn't look to me like it's really ready for prime time yet, but the hype is building, and there's the imperative to be able to take that model of surveillance capitalism that's associated with the internet and find ways to implement it in real life. That has real economic heft behind it. And so I suspect we're going to see this ongoing attempt from the private sector as well to, in the name of convenience, in the name of speed, accuracy, or not accuracy, speed, access, etc., to develop these types of interfaces. And I think it's something we need to keep an eye on and think about regulatory responses. So
yeah, and just quickly, there's a question in the chat. I mean, Mark, thank you. What a fantastic perspective, helicopter. I like what Scott said about helicopter perspective on this. And I think it's such an evolving topic. Obviously, there are internationally coalitions of civil society groups pushing back on this sort of surveillance. Do you, is there a conversation about how to roll back some of this? I see people in chat kind of discussing, the health measures being kind of then reused and upcycled for regular policing. And we've definitely seen that in certain places. Singapore was one of the, Israel, I think initially was one of the examples that immediately used that data in that way. And then Singapore very recently used that data for investigations. And then there's also a question here about whether Clearview informs disabled people that their image has been collected. I don't know if you could speak to that, but my impression is no one was informed that their image was collected. And the sort of challenges you can embrace to Clearview and the way they did that is very determined by your, where you are in the world. I don't know, Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you're right about Clearview. I put that in the chat. They didn't inform anybody, and that's why they're being sued. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. There's also a claim that by scraping the data, they violated the terms of use of the social media platforms. In terms of the conversations, I think I missed the substance of that earlier question. But your point about COVID is I mentioned that relatively early on, but I think one interesting question to keep an eye on is the extent to which these types of concerns about touchlessness and these coupling of facial recognition with other forms of biometric sensing. So in the wake of the pandemic, for example, linking facial recognition with remote temperature sensing to be able to identify individuals who have elevated, have symptoms. The use of facial recognition to enforce quarantine. In Australia, a couple of jurisdictions have used basically facial recognition tethers, right? To make sure that you're following quarantine, you get called, You have to verify who you are by inputting your face, and then the coordinates of your phone are matched to that to prove that you are where you're supposed to be when you're doing quarantine. The use of these technologies has an exceptional feel for the pandemic moment, but the question I think remains, after this pandemic, the extent to which these types of processes will remain in place for, quote unquote, public health, public safety, public security, once these infrastructures are put in place. I think that's something we need to keep an eye on as well.
I was just going to jump in. I'm so grateful that you've written that, Mark. I think I'm really looking forward to reading the whole thing, and I'm dreading clicking on that link, but I will nonetheless, because I think it's an important thing to do. One of the things that occurs to me talking about this is how surveillance of public places does often elicit concern from people because they feel they should be able to move around public places without being watched. But there is also a tendency to implement some of these surveillance technologies in workplace settings, either as a trial run or as part of then alternative uses for the technology. People might remember Google Glass, for example, the glasses you were supposed to wear and wander around, and you could then have your social media feed running at the same time. And it was widely rejected. I think everyone who wore them was called glass holes. But the idea of that technology was then repurposed for workplace settings and is being rolled out in factories, for example, car manufacturing factories. So not only does the employer get to see what the worker is doing, but it also assists them to do their job. But the surveillance component is there. And it's interesting, in the last day or so, Amazon is apparently reportedly intending to install cameras in all of the vehicles of delivery drivers, which you can see how that then becomes this kind of creeping surveillance state that obviously surveils workers, but eventually the public too, of sorts. And how the workplace tends to be a place where in actual fact you might have less of a capacity to resist it than a public space generally. So that's another part of the report that I thought might be worth talking a bit more about now, that relationship between workplace surveillance and then that being something that then becomes a standard for public spaces. Peter, I might throw to you because that was your chapter. Did you want to talk a little bit about workplace surveillance and how this is a digital rights issue?
Yeah, I think there's two interesting issues. One is the way that things are changing so fast in the way that workplace surveillance works. So it's, 20 years ago, it might have been a video camera watching somebody to see if they weren't taking money out of the till. And there were protocols around that built into industrial law. And now it's a ubiquitous capture everything because it might create value somewhere along the way. So there's both the watching, the productivity piece, and the secondary value piece. I think work is an interesting place to go in terms of running public awareness campaigns because everyone's there. But also there is a tradition of regulating around the workplace through industrial law and industrial mechanisms that aren't so embedded in other parts of the way we live. The work that we've been doing with the Centre and a bunch of unions has been trying to get, I think, fair to say, Labor side of politics at least thinking this through, because there's not a whole lot of, I think, understanding of both the nuances of the problem, but also the scope of the solutions. And there's a future of work process going on in the New South Wales upper house where the New South Wales Labor's in opposition. It's really a policy formatting and public awareness piece, but later this year there'll be a focus on workplace surveillance. I know Lauren Kelly, who's part of the Digital Rights Watch crew, has put in a fantastic submission there that we can probably share in the chat as well. Where I'd like to see it go is probably three places. One is kind of around the idea of being I guess there's the permission and what is okay and what's not okay, because that's not defined at the moment. There used to be laws against surveillance that was covert. Is ticker box mean that it's not covert anymore? The second level, I think, is around the rights workers have to understand how their information is being used, and from there can become discussions about how any value from that extraction can be shared, who owns it, how it can be used. And I think the end of that discussion ends in some of the really interesting thinking that I know is being driven from Alex White at the ACTU around the idea of worker trusts, worker data trusts. And a lot of that is really blue sky, but what excites me about the workplace piece is that it's not about creating a whole set of new principles. We've got, as you would know, there are principles around right of access to the workplace. There's principles around the limits of how far an employer can encroach into someone's life. So it seems to be a really interesting anchor point to think through how these laws should adopt to the new technology that's moving so fast.
Yeah, and I just to point out, Andrew just shared in the chat the video from Amazon sharing this, and it's like a marketing video. I encourage everyone to give that a watch after. It's very creepy.
Yeah.
I think we've just really normalized this year pointing cameras at people's faces as they go about their day. And to me, that's like the most, like we did it, Mark kind of touched upon this with the conference, but that we had, to me, one of the worrying things, and the one that kind of went so almost under the radar was, children being monitored by camera to see if they were paying attention, to see if they were in attendance. And the nature of it was like a lot of them were working from their own bedrooms, so here you suddenly are normalizing a camera being on in a child's bedroom to monitor their responses. That to me, that's, I'm just got chills talking about it just now. But that sort of normalization, and that comes with the Amazon piece as well, right? So they're proposing to have a camera pointed forward and space to monitor the neighborhood, but it's also pointed at the person. And I think, I don't know, Peter, if you have any thoughts about how that, or Lizzie, I know you've written a ton about workers' rights in these spaces, but do you guys have thoughts about how that changes the dynamic, and why is that super toxic?
It's almost a rhetorical question, isn't it? The other piece on Amazon that was interesting last year was that they were advertising for data analysts whose part of their brief was to identify movements of workers in terms of preempting union organizing, and so all that workplace democracy as well. So the idea of workers, even in the workplace, having private spaces where they can be citizens under the way we used to organize society is kind of fairly fundamental, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a union, I was until very recently a union representative at my workplace and have bargained on to obtain EBAs and the like. And one of the things I think is that we do need to be more proactive as unions in terms of thinking about these issues and limiting it. Someone mentioned in the chat the Microsoft Insights tool on using the suite of Microsoft products, how you can now monitor employees' productivity, however so defined by them. And, this is just, again, a kind of normalization. There's now an expectation that kind of it's there now, management should use this, when in fact, there's many assumptions embedded into that particular form of reporting that are potentially problematic in all sorts of ways, let alone the piece around what kind of a workplace it creates when you're constantly being watched and tracked by your manager. And I think there are opportunities for unions to kind of start pushing back on these things. The report that I posted that Lauren, who's on our board, was involved in drafting from the United Workers Union go into these things, but you could also push back on these things specifically, like if a company is going to use Microsoft, that they not be permitted to use that for any management purposes and things like that. Like they are, because so many of these companies are kind of pitching themselves quite directly as creating tools of management. I think that does give us an opportunity to have the conversation quite directly and start organising around these issues as well. And unions, when they do organise, have a great impact. Domestic violence leave, for example, was something that wasn't even an issue a number of years ago and is now often standard in these agreements. And I think this is something that falls into that category as well. It's the kind of issue that's coming to the fore. People are more aware of it than ever, particularly as they might be working from home. Let's have that discussion in the context of organising and making demands on employers. And I think we're well placed to do that. And that's a surefire way as well to gather and gain union membership.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And obviously when you're monitoring like people who are you interacting with in a workspace, that has huge implications. And I think I remember a few years ago, they rolled out a system where people were walking around the office with like a chip in their cart, like that scanned their location around the office to figure out like the locations where you spend most of your time. So if you're in the kitchen a lot, it's like your manager can have a conversation with you about it. Justin made the point that it means they're not great managers, but I'm not sure that's how we can change the behavior. I mean, speaking of, this I think creates a nice little segue. Also speaking of activism and sort of online offline spaces. And Kat smiled as I said that because she knew I was going to punt it to her. But I think there's been a lot that digital platforms have had to grapple with, of all of this activity suddenly coming online. And I think some of the digital platforms, for what it's worth, I do think they try to grapple with the question of how to kind of maintain some sort of anonymity and give people some sort of protections in these instances. Do you feel like there has been a response, or what is lacking? Are activists just as at risk online as they are offline?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say they're more at risk online than offline. I think it depends on the types of tools that we use to organize and communicate with people as well. We have a tendency to kind of use the tools at our disposal already, and that might be Facebook Messenger and it might be Gmail, when we're trying to organize with people and share fairly sensitive information that is interrogating power. And people will just use the things that they're familiar with, which please don't. But the point that we want to get across in this piece that we wrote for the report is that there are options and there are meaningful choices that we can make. And I think the response from big tech companies to affording its users more anonymity or more privacy is only because we've fought so hard, and there are commercial risks in not giving those that level of privacy and that level of security to people. It's only because of the slowly, incrementally increasing digital literacy of users and the power of legislation, which is going to put pressure on these kind of like commercial private entities. But it's still low. And even speaking on this normalization of surveillance that keeps coming up in workplaces and in public places and in digital places, that breeds this level of apathy and futility that is the most difficult thing to get past when we're trying to increase the digital security or the digital capacity of our communities. There's this futility of, oh, everyone knows everything about me. Facebook knows everything about me. The CIA agent who lives in my computer knows everything about me. So what's the point in trying to do anything or make any meaningful changes in my online behavior if there's a digital footprint that is of such a high fidelity that I can't meaningfully make any change? But we can use encrypted messaging. We can, and then the most meaningful changes that we can make always come down to these like analog decisions too. Like that's how we keep our communities safe. Like how do we navigate these protocols with each other? How do we build trust with each other? It tends to come into these offline spaces as well before it comes into the online.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I wonder, I'm trying to multitask with like reading the chat as I do this. I mean, Justin, do you want to repeat that for people who aren't able to do what I'm doing, which is about, why do we need different tools, and how that's in different spaces?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the point I just made in the chat there was that we know that people do care about things like privacy and digital rights. They've told us that in reports and research for decades. The thing about the apathy, they're not apathetic. It's just that they don't really actually feel that they know what to do, and that's like it's hard. Like I work in the industry and I find it difficult to understand the nuances and and these products are designed to deliberately make it hard as well. So that's part of the problem. For us as digital rights activists and people who care about this, part of our responsibility, I think, is that we need to help people to help themselves. We need to stop waiting for a silver bullet, that there's this one perfect piece of legislation and now that it's illegal, suddenly the behavior will stop. That doesn't happen. We need to have a range of things and we need to be doing all of them all the time. That's exhausting, And that's why it needs all of us to work together to do this. There's lots of us though, so we don't have to do everything ourselves individually. We can share the load between us. It's more like a relay than a marathon or a sprint. So I think we need to probably give up a little bit of, oh, if we can just focus on a couple of politicians and do this one thing and, you know, change the Privacy Act, that will do. I think we need to be probably helping people to help themselves a lot more so that we get more of those grassroots kind of guerrilla efforts like we had with Robodebt. That was one of the features of Robodebt, was highlighting people's individual experiences and helping them to find community and help each other. That was extremely powerful and worked really well. We had a similar thing with like the COVID Safe app and the widespread community concern about things, which was amplified and given voice by people who you know have their own expertise. But if we can amplify others rather than trying to center ourselves as like, hey, I'll, you know, follow me, I'll save you all, like helping people to help themselves, I think is going to be vastly more effective and can also help us to kind of build that pressure on government to do the things like pass strong legislation, fund regulators who will actually take action on our behalf so that we don't have to individually sue every single company because they put poison in our coffee. You know, it used to be bread used to get poisoned and adulterated, and then we passed various laws to say that no, bread shouldn't actually contain any sawdust. It should be made with flour. So there's a long history of how this happens. I think we need to both cut ourselves a bit of slack, but also look at ourselves a bit more harshly and say, are we really helping people, or are we kind of trying to consolidate power in ourselves too much?
Yeah, wow. So many great points, I think, across both Kat and what you just said. You know, to me, the power of the individual was super exemplified when Max Schrems, who may or may not ring bell, some of you are nodding. He basically sued Facebook. He really went to litigate as an individual that the data sharing that was happening. He's an Austrian citizen, not Australian, Austria, the other EU country in Europe. And so he was alleging that the data sharing that was happening between Facebook Europe and Facebook US violated his rights because the US government surveils the information that is passed through those networks in the US. And he won that first court case, and that was really monumental in bringing a lot of light to things. And it it was one of the big catalysts that broke down the data sharing agreement between EU and US, which at the time was Safe Harbor, then became Privacy Shield. Now that one's invalid as well. So it's a fun history. But Mark Schrems as an individual, now he has a legal team and a substantial amount of funding. But back then he was just a law student who was frustrated that nothing was being done, to shift sort of the power. And I wonder if I can pivot on this sort of idea. And Sam, I think the interesting thing, what Kat said to me is what I encountered a lot, and that's this heavy sort of feeling that activists have online, that there's little they can do to escape the structures that are around them, but they can also utilize them for their activism, right? So what to you is that balance between the internet being a catalyst as well as something that can put people in danger? And talk to us about the platforms and how they've responded.
Firstly, it just started pouring rain, so I hope you can hear me okay. So I feel really torn about this because on the one hand, everything feels like it's falling to shit. But on the other hand, it also feels like there's this kind of brewing groundswell that's happening at the moment. And obviously, most of us in this virtual room are across these things and we've been paying attention to these things for quite a long time. But 2020 was really interesting because it felt like there was quite a shift in the more mainstream thinking about these power relations between us as individuals and communities and digital platforms, and how their business models are working and how that impacts us. And I think that came out in a few ways in 2020, but one of the ones that's particularly interesting, and I go into it a bit in my piece, but also Yasmin Abdel-Majid also goes into this in quite some depth in her piece, And it's about how these platforms, they're not empty notice boards where, you know, there's truly equitable access for everyone. You can just post whatever you like under this promise of free expression. All the while they're behind the scenes pulling strings and making a profit out of it, which I think is something that's really kind of come to light in this over the last year. And something that I think was interesting, and kind of going back to what Scott was saying before about how sometimes it's the scrappy movements that can be the most effective, not the big coordinated ones, is I've really enjoyed seeing activists online who normally, you know, are using social media to propel their movements and you know, amplify them, actually turn their attention back onto the platforms themselves. And so, you know, we saw examples like TikTokers, and I'm like reluctant to talk about TikTok because I'm always talking about TikTok. They pushed back against this glitch against Black Lives Matter posts. And then, you know, we saw activists in the UK and across Australia that pushed back using Instagram against Instagram's own content moderation policy. And they really started to bring that into the more like mainstream discussion, which is really important, because there's no point, you know, if it's just us talking about these in a little echo chamber, it's nice, but it was really nice to see that conversation grow a bit broader into the mainstream sort of narrative. The other example that I think is really interesting is because obviously we're really reliant on digital platforms, especially in 2020 when we're all stuck at home. We want to like watch the National Theatre, stream that live and have music playing through Spotify and things like that. I think it became really evident that these platforms are benefiting from creators, activists, artists, because we populate them with content, but then they don't support those creators. And so that dynamic started to come out a bit more profoundly. And we saw musicians pushing back against Spotify for essentially unfair payment for streams models, which has always been a thing, but because of the dynamic of 2020 and everyone being at home, it really like amplified that. So yeah, coming back to where I started, I'm torn about it, but I'm hopeful, you know.
Kat, do you see that sort of balance for sort of the environmental activism, even Indigenous activism? You know, there are so many, there are certainly, I think, perks, but so many challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And these tools are really good. They're obviously like they're built to connect people, but they're also built to extract and track us and harvest as much information as possible. And finding that balance is really challenging. And it's a personal decision that we need to make on an individual level, but also keep in mind the people in our orbit and in our communities, because when we're opting into these platforms and the level of information that we're choosing to share, it's not just affecting us, it's also kind of radiating out into our networks. So Facebook, really good at connecting people, but also really good at making money off of your data. And that's just a choice that we need to make.
And in terms of the security and kind of communicate, I mean, absolutely, but you know, should the platforms be doing more? Should the governments, should there be more resources for civil society? Like how do we begin to rebalance that dynamic?
Gosh, all of it? Is that an awful naff answer? Like all of it? Yeah, I don't want the onus to be completely on an individual to build a kind of like a shield that's robust enough to protect ourselves from corporate interests and capitalism and our apathetic government and legislation that isn't quite robust enough yet. I want all of it. I want individuals to care enough about security and have enough digital literacy to make meaningful decisions so that corporations start building checks and balances that mean that we can make meaningful choices and that we can meaningfully consent to how much data we're bartering with these organizations. And then I also want legislation that protects us as well at the same time. And so it's a huge network of digital security that all needs to be kind of raised, but yeah, I don't think there's no one silver bullet. I just want it all to be better.
Yeah, there's literal thunder. Just sorry, if I'm looking out startled, it's because there's a lot of lightning happening. Countries clearly angry with the way digital policy is being treated. Yeah, it's Sam. Did you want to chime in on meaningful content? Because Kat just kind of threw that in there, but that's a challenging sort of notion, and I'm putting you on the spot because I know we've spoken a lot about it and what we think about it at Digital Rights Watch. But did you want to chime in on that?
About meaningful consent?
Yeah.
3 minutes. Okay. Less than. I mean, I think like I agree with Kat in the sense that yes, people should be able to make good digital security, data security choices and whatnot, but I just really resent the onus that is placed onto individuals to have to protect themselves, to have to be thinking about privacy, to have to be reading ridiculous privacy policies and all of these things. Like it's insane. I'm sure most of you would agree with this. You can't possibly give meaningful consent in that kind of power dynamic, you know? I think we need to fundamentally shift that to be able to have meaningful conversations about what a consent model might look like.
Yeah, that's good short answer. I'm conscious of time and we're coming up on 2, but Peter has given me graciously permission to roll a few minutes over if we need to. And I did want to bring up the question that Katie asked, because there was a couple of plus ones to it in the chats. And that is, in terms of digital literacy, what is the digital literacy among MPs? How do we improve the knowledge of issues among our lawmakers? I don't think it has to be just MPs. It can be a lot of local decision makers too. And obviously open floor, I do think it would be nice to have Scott chime in here just because he sat in them halls and he might be the most familiar.
I'm going to sidestep it. I'm not sure, like there's a lot of digital illiteracy, right? Like there's a lot of, not to be super ageist, but there's a lot of people in that place who were born a long time before these technologies were widely dispersed, who still have quite archaic views about online safety and so on. But actually, I'm not sure that it's the right place to attack the problem, partly because, as Lizzie put in the chat, a lot of these people know exactly what they're doing. I don't know that Peter Dutton is all that digitally literate, but he knows a lot about power and how to leverage these platforms to accumulate it. And the other thing is that a lot of this isn't driven by politicians at all. You will see the same departmental secretaries and really senior bureaucrats in AGD and Home Affairs sitting at the table. They'll just burn through minister after minister, and the agenda and the kind of infrastructure stays in place. They'll get through an attorney general and they'll just get a new one who'll advance this piece of the agenda. So literacy is important, obviously, but I think we're dealing with something more menacing than mere incompetence. It's probably worth naming that up.
I don't think you sidestepped that at all. I think that was a nice full yeah, we're all nodding. I think that was a nice full stride with the question. Lizzie, did you want to hop in on that? Because I saw you kind of nodding along to what Scott was saying.
Oh yeah, I mean, Scott's nailed it. I suppose I would just say, I've directly lobbied politicians on technical questions, and I've actually watched, very sophisticated industry operators explain why conservative talking points don't actually work in the context of the proposal being pushed, and get slammed. And it is a question of power. And what that means, I think, is that we do have to organise. I mean, I said this in the chat, but you can put pressure on politicians to do better, and you can organise and advocate to do that. And you also have to push back not just against the interests of departmental officials and vested interests in Canberra, but also against industry, because they spend far more money on lobbying politicians than we do. So I think we've got the potential to organise better and to have a strong voice, because there's lots of us who are affected and we're all pretty worried about this. And it's translating that into pressure on decision makers to actually represent us instead of the national security state or big tech, which is what we're going to be left with unless we start building power ourselves. And so that's the kind of idea here, that you don't need a computer science degree really to comment on these topics. But if you've got an interest in politics and in power, And these kinds of issues that we've canvassed in the report and discussed today, whether it's environmental activism or public space and how you design geographically design public spaces, then you've got something to say about this technology. And we welcome those voices in building power so that we can hold those who represent us accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this might be actually a great point to just try and throw back to Vanessa if she's gotten her microphone working about that.
Let's try. How's that?
Oh, yes.
Yay. Okay, excellent. So let me talk about the other end of the "it's just about power" thing, because I absolutely 100% agree. It is just about power. And so let's look at the other end of the power angle, right? Because the other end of the power angle is kind of 25 ordinary people who probably agree with us a lot more than they agree with the powerful bureaucrats pushing surveillance. So think about COVID safe. I don't think that the thing that actually made a difference, maybe we made a little bit of a difference, the kind of bunch of geeks explaining that it had terrible security and privacy properties. What really made a difference was nearly 25 million people who either didn't download it in the first place or uninstalled it a few weeks later. And I think it's consistent throughout all of the marketing about COVID safe that they've consistently refused to say how many people are still running it, even though that information is readily available to them. And I infer that almost nobody is still running it. So we, as a bunch of geeks saying a bunch of stuff about it, had a little bit of an influence, but the huge thing that actually made a difference was millions of ordinary people just choosing not to participate. So I think there are a bunch of other ways in which we can facilitate millions of ordinary people choosing to not participate in at least some of these kinds of things. So I could pick up numerous examples across what we've discussed today. For example, the thing about photo surveillance of school kids also gives me the creeps. And I happen to have some school kids, so I was tremendously amused when my 14-year-old told me with disgust how annoying it had to be to set up a virtual camera on his computer so that he could put a static photo of himself with a plausible looking background behind him so that his school's ongoing surveillance thing could kind of think that he was there while he was reading a book instead of listening to RE class. So the point is, these things are possible. You tend to need a fair amount of technical knowledge. I'd love to know how much technical knowledge you need to fight back against facial surveillance in public places, for example. Right? A lot of the people selling this software are selling it to somebody who wants to do the surveillance. I'm not any kind of an expert on it, but the accuracy rates tend to be incredibly optimistic and they tend to assume no deliberate obfuscation on the part of the people walking past the camera. You know, what if you wear your glasses and a mask and you wear high heels to obscure the way you walk or something, right? I think what we should concentrate on is exactly the opposite side of the power issue that Scott and Lizzie identified, is empowering the large bunch of ordinary people to resist. And you don't need a computer science degree, but it helps.
Well, I was going to say mic drop. What a great way. I'm conscious Vanessa, first of all, shout out to your teenager in the comments. Everyone agrees. We salute. I think kids always have the most innovative solutions. The Edward Snowden book kind of details how he changed all the clocks in his house. That was like his first great hack, was to change the clocks in his house so he could have a later bedtime. And I'm just imagining that parent completely exhausted with a glass of wine at like 11 and the clock's still saying 8 p.m. and like, for God's sake, why can't it be that time yet? So I think kids have a sort of ingenuity and defiance to some of these rules that we make as adults. I'm really conscious that we're just a little bit over time and I've seen people dropping off at 2. So I think we'll wrap there. I do want to say a huge thank you for everyone who's joined us here today and helping us launch this report. We do hope that this one and the next one and the next one after that serve as exactly the basis for these sort of conversations. Huge thanks to Peter for letting us take over the Tech Talk, and we'll obviously you'll be seeing a lot of Digital Rights Watch around as well this year. And a massive, if you'll all join me in a virtual clap to all of the participants and those who contributed in the report. Yeah, arms, jazz hands. Yeah, big thank you all around. And yeah, if you have any feedback about the report, let us know. Peter, did you want to sign off? All good?
Oh, well, we'll be doing fortnightly. Please keep coming back. And I don't quite know what the format's going to be yet, but we'll make something work. Bye, everyone.
Woohoo. Have a nice Friday.